Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 17, verse 28, which says, "Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent." Oh my gosh. Wow. That is awesome. That is awesome right there. You know, the reason I wanted to look at this verse in particular is because there is an old saying that is often misattributed to legends like Abraham Lincoln, right? Mark Twain, and seemingly everyone else throughout history, which is itself a little ironic given its subject. You know, it says, "Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt." Nobody is entirely sure who said it first, but everybody recognizes the truth in it, because we have all been in rooms where someone talked too much and we all knew it. And most of us, if we are honest, have been that person at least once. Myself personally, bro, way too many times, way more times than I would have liked, man. I need to learn how to shut my freaking trap sometimes, bro. But the point I'm trying to make here is that Proverbs 17:28, the verse that we just read, is Solomon's version, King Solomon's version of that observation. And it is one of the wittiest verses in the entire book. But underneath the wit is a very important insight about the relationship between silence and wisdom, and what our words, or lack thereof, actually communicate about what is going on inside of us. And so this verse arrives at the very end of Proverbs 17, a chapter that has had a lot to say about the tongue. Verse 4 warned about listening to wicked lips. Verse 7 addressed inappropriate speech. Verse 9 connected covering offenses to love. Verse 20 described the crooked heart and the lying tongue. But by the time we reach verse 28, Solomon has been circling the theme of speech and its consequences all chapter long, but his final word on the subject in this chapter is almost a punchline, and yet it carries real significant weight. And so let's break down the verse here. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. Man, I mean, look, the structure of this verse is what makes it so memorable, right? Like, Solomon does not say a wise person is considered wise when they are quiet, because that would be unremarkable. He says even a fool is considered wise when they are quiet. The even is doing all the work here. It is an acknowledgement that silence is so powerful to a communicator of wisdom that it can create the impression of wisdom where wisdom does not actually exist. Now, I'm pretty sure Solomon isn't trying to tell us to fake it, but I think he's trying to say that is a reflection of wisdom itself, in a way, right? Because like the word fool here, for context, is the Hebrew word evil, the morally obstinate fool we first encountered back in Proverbs 1:7, the person who has a settled disposition about wisdom and instruction. So this is not someone who is simply unlearned or inexperienced. This is someone whose foolishness runs pretty deep. And yet even in this person, simply by keeping their mouth closed, can be perceived as wise by the people around them. And this is simultaneously a compliment to silence and an indictment of how much we rely on words to assess wisdom in others, right? We're human. We make rapid judgments about people's intellect and insight based on what they say and how confidently they say it. Like a person who speaks with authority and frequency signals intelligence to us, even when what they are saying does not hold up under scrutiny, right? But a person who says nothing signals depth, even when there is nothing particularly deep behind the silence. And Solomon is exposing the limits of that evaluation system with with a pretty interesting sense of humor, dry humor, all right? Keep silent translate a Hebrew word that means to be still, to hold back, to refrain. It is not passive inactively, but an active choice to withhold our speech. And so the fool in this verse is not silent because they have nothing to say. No, the implication is that they have something to say and are choosing not to say it. That choice, whatever its motivation, produces a perception of wisdom that the fool has not earned through their character of thinking. In Ecclesiastes, which Solomon wrote as well, in chapter 5, 2-3, he connects to this observation from a slightly different angle. He says, "Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few, for a dream comes with much business and a fool's voice with many words." And so the fool's voice here is characterized by many words, and the inverse is what Proverbs 17:28 is describing. Fewer words, even from a fool, changes the impression entirely. And now I want to look at the part of the verse where Solomon says, when he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. And so the second half of this verse reinforces the first with slightly different language. Deemed intelligent uses a Hebrew context that means to be discerning, understanding, possessing the kind of perceptive insight that we associate with wisdom. And closing the lips produces the perception of this quality even in someone who does not actually possess it. And this is where the most important clarification of the verse needs to be made clearly, because it is the place where this verse is most commonly misunderstood. Like Proverbs 17:28, let's not get it twisted, is not saying that silence equals wisdom. No, it is saying that silence can produce the perception of wisdom. Those are two very different things, but the difference matters enormously. Because a genuinely wise person who is silent is wise whether they speak or not. Right? Their silence reflects actual depth, careful thought, and the kind of self-possession that does not need to fill every conversational space with their own voice. A fool who is silent is still a fool, right? Their silence has changed nothing inherently about their character, their thinking, or their actual understanding. What it has changed is how others perceive them, and that is a strictly eternal shift that has no substance behind it. Solomon, therefore, is not giving us a technique for appearing wise. No, he is making an observation about human perception that we consistently overestimate the wisdom of quiet people and underestimate the foolishness concealed by silence. And so the genuine wisdom this verse points toward is not learning to keep your mouth shut to impress people, but it is developing the actual inner depth that makes silence a natural expression of real wisdom rather than a performance masking its absence. So Job 13:5, even in the Old Testament, captures this tension almost perfectly in the context of Job's unhelpful friends, right? They were saying to him, that you would keep silent, and it will be your wisdom. So Job is saying that his friends' only path to appearing wise at this point is to stop talking. The more they speak, the more clearly their lack of genuine understanding is exposed. And so their silence would have served everyone better, including themselves in that context. And even James 1:19, which we reference in Proverbs 15:18, applies directly here as well. James says in that chapter, "Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." Right? The slow to speak is not just about avoiding angry outbursts, but it is a general posture toward conversation, one in which listening precedes speaking, where understanding is sought before opinion is offered, where the compulsion to fill silence is resisted in favor of actually absorbing what is happening in the room. So let's get practical here. Let's get applicable, because as I always say in my videos, that is where knowledge turns into action. And I truly believe that is one of the most important parts of our Christian walk. And so the first thing here is to cultivate the habit of speaking less and listening more in conversations that matter. I feel like the most direct application of this verse is the simplest and the hardest at the same time, because most of us are not naturally inclined towards silence in conversation. At least I'm not personally, right? Maybe you are, which is good, but I'm not. I feel pressure to contribute, to demonstrate that I'm engaged, and to fill the space before it becomes awkward, especially that part. But Proverbs 17:28 suggests that our compulsive filling of conversational space is often doing us more harm than good, not just in terms of perception, but in terms of actual understanding. When we're talking, we are not learning. But when we are listening, we are. And so the practical discipline here is to enter conversations with a conscious intention to understand before we respond, to ask more questions and make fewer declarations, to resist the urge to speak before we have actually thought about what we want to say. And that habit, practiced consistently, builds that kind of genuine wisdom that makes our eventual words worth hearing. And the second thing is to learn to distinguish between silence that reflects wisdom and silence that avoids responsibility. This is the clarification that keeps the verse from being misapplied, because not all silence is wise, and it is possible to weaponize Proverbs 17:28 here that we just read as a justification for never speaking up when we should. Because let's not get it twisted, right? There are moments when wisdom requires us to say something difficult, to offer a hard truth, or to address a situation that our silence would only perpetuate. Like Proverbs 27:5, way later in the book, draws this line clearly, where Solomon says, "Better is open rebuke than hidden love," because sometimes love speaks when silence should be easier, or would be easier, and sometimes wisdom requires saying the uncomfortable thing rather than maintaining the comfortable appearance of quiet depth. And so the genuine wisdom from this verse is pointing toward it knows the difference between silence that reflects actual thoughtfulness and silence that is simply the avoidance of the cost of speaking truthfully. And the last thing here is to let this verse redirect our ambition from sounding wise to actually becoming wise. You know, perhaps the deepest application of this verse is the way it exposes a temptation most of us carry without acknowledging it.
We want to be perceived as intelligent, insightful, and wise.
Right? Like, this verse tells us that we can produce that perception even as a fool simply by keeping quiet. But the question it leaves us with is whether we are content with the perception or whether we actually want the reality. Because if we only want to seem wise, then strategic silence is a surprisingly effectively tool. But if we actually want to be wise, then silence is only part of the picture, because it needs to be accompanied by genuine pursuit of wisdom, the kind we have been tracing throughout this entire series in Proverbs: humility, teachability, the fear of the Lord, the reverence of the Lord, and the willingness to be shaped by something outside of ourselves. And so the fool who keeps silent is considered wise, but the person who keeps silent because they are genuinely thinking, listening, and growing is actually becoming wise, because one is a performance and the other is real transformation. So let me just give a closing thought here, right? Because this verse, Proverbs 17:28, is a verse that is almost playful in its observation and profound concurrently in its implication. Because the simple fact that even a fool appears wise when silent tells us something important about the power of restraint, and something equally important about the limits of how we evaluate wisdom in others. But the deeper invitation underneath the observation is not to learn the art of strategic silence, but it is to become the kind of person whose silence is genuine rather than performed, whose words, when they do come, are worth the space they occupy, and whose inner life has enough actual depth that it does not need to constantly announce itself to be taken seriously. Always remember, guys, the fool keeps silent and is considered wise, but the truly wise person keeps silent because they actually are.